He had lived on that land for almost 12 years. When he first bought it, it was nothing more than a quiet stretch of open ground, with a small house sitting back from the road. No gates, no guards, no signs talking about rules or fees, just land, trees, and space to breathe. That was exactly why he chose it. He wanted peace, not paperwork. Over the years, he fixed the house little by little, planted trees, built a simple wooden fence, and added a small shed where he kept tools and old boxes. Nothing fancy, just a normal life. Most of his neighbors were friendly but distant. Everyone kept to themselves. There was a large neighborhood not too far away, filled with newer homes and clean streets. That neighborhood had a homeowners association, but it had never been his concern. Their entrance sign sat far down the road, clearly marking where their community began. As far as he knew, his property sat outside of all that. No one had ever told him otherwise. One quiet morning, everything changed. He found the letter taped to his mailbox. It was white, thick, and official-looking. At first, he thought it was some kind of advertisement. When he opened it, his stomach tightened. The letter claimed he was in violation of several HOA rules. It listed issues with his fence, his shed, and even the condition of his driveway. At the bottom, there was a warning about fines and possible legal action if he did not comply within 30 days. He read it 3 times. Slowly. It made no sense. He was not part of any HOA. He never signed anything. He never paid fees. He never agreed to follow their rules. He walked back into his house, sat at the table, and read it again. The letter spoke as if he was already a member. It didn't ask. It ordered. At first, he laughed quietly to himself. Surely this was a mistake. Someone must have mixed up addresses. He set the letter aside and went on with his day. But the uneasy feeling stayed with him. That night, he placed the letter back on the table and studied the details. The address was correct. His name was correct. The HOA name belonged to the nearby community. The next day, he decided to call the number on the letter. A woman answered in a firm, practiced voice. When he explained that he did not belong to the HOA, she paused, then said their records showed his property was within their authority. Her tone made it sound like the matter was already settled. She told him compliance was required and ended the call. That was the moment confusion turned into concern. Over the next week, more letters arrived. Each one sounded more serious than the last. They spoke of violations, deadlines, and penalties. One letter mentioned placing a lien on his property if he failed to cooperate. He felt his chest tighten as he read it. This was no longer a small mistake. This was pressure. He tried talking to a few neighbors. Some shrugged and said the HOA had been getting stricter lately. Others avoided the topic completely. One neighbor quietly warned him that the HOA had a reputation for pushing people until they gave in. That made his situation feel heavier. Then the visits began. One afternoon, he noticed a car parked near his fence. 2 people stood outside, taking photos and pointing at his property. When he walked over and asked what they were doing, they introduced themselves as HOA representatives. They told him they were documenting violations. They spoke calmly, but there was something cold in their words. When he said again that he was not part of the HOA, one of them said, "That will be decided soon." After that, he felt watched. He stopped enjoying his mornings. Every sound outside made him glance through the window. He worried about what might come next. He had worked too hard to build this life to let someone take control of it without reason. Still, he tried to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. Late one night, he pulled out the folder from when he first bought the land. Inside were old papers yellowed with time. Deeds, maps, signatures. He spread them across the table. He remembered the long process of buying the property, how careful he had been. The land survey had clearly shown boundaries. He traced the lines with his finger. According to these documents, his property sat outside the HOA development that gave him some relief, but also raised a question. If this was so clear, why was the HOA acting this way? The next morning, he went to the county records office. It was a small building, quiet and slow-moving. He waited in line and explained his situation to a clerk. The clerk pulled up records on a screen and compared them with older maps. After a few minutes, she frowned slightly and turned the screen so he could see. The boundaries did not match the HOA's claims. She told him plainly that his land was not part of the HOA, never had been. Hearing that should have ended the problem. Instead, it deepened it. He asked for copies of the records and paid a small fee. As he left the office, he felt both relieved and angry. Relieved that the truth was on his side, angry that it had come to this at all. Someone was trying to control land they had no right to. That afternoon, another notice appeared on his door. This one demanded immediate action. The language was stronger. It spoke of enforcement and consequences. He noticed something new at the bottom of the page. A fine amount. That was when he realized this wasn't an accident. This was a pattern. He sat alone that evening, the house quiet around him. He thought about how many people might have given in already. How many might have paid fines just to avoid trouble. The idea made him uneasy. If he stayed silent, this would continue. If he pushed back, things could get worse. Still, he knew one thing for sure. The land was his, and no letter could change that. He placed the documents neatly into a folder and set them by the door. Tomorrow, he would take the next step. Not with anger, not with fear, but with facts. Whatever this HOA thought they were doing, they'd picked the wrong property to test their power, as the sun set outside. He stood by the window and looked across his land. The fence, the shed, the driveway. Nothing about it felt wrong. It felt earned. And for the first time since the letters began, he felt a quiet resolve settle in. This was only the beginning. The next few days felt heavier than before. Even though he now had proof from the county office, the pressure did not stop. In fact, it seemed to grow. Another letter arrived, this one delivered by certified mail. He had to sign for it. That alone made his hands shake a little. The message inside repeated the same claims, but added new language about continued noncompliance. It said inspectors would return if changes were not made. He placed the letter on the table beside the others. The pile was growing. What bothered him most was the tone. None of the letters asked questions. None suggested a misunderstanding. Every word assumed guilt. It felt less like a mistake and more like a push. That afternoon, he decided to respond. He wrote a calm letter explaining that his property was not part of the HOA. He included copies of the county, records, and the original survey. He did not accuse. He did not insult. He simply stated facts. He mailed it and kept copies for himself. For a short moment, he hoped that would be the end of it. 2 days later, a truck stopped near his driveway. 2 HOA board members stepped out. They did not knock. They stood near the fence, pointing and talking, writing things down. When he walked outside and asked why they were there, one of them smiled in a tight, practiced way and said they were following up on unresolved violations. He told them again that his land was not under their control. He showed them copies of the documents. They barely looked. One of them said their legal team would review it. Another warned him that ignoring HOA authority often led to serious consequences. Their words were polite, but the meaning was clear. They expected him to back down. After they left, he stood alone by the fence for a long time. His hands were clenched, not from fear, but from frustration. He felt like he was being tested, like they wanted to see how far they could push before he broke. That night, sleep came slowly. Every sound outside pulled him awake. His mind kept replaying the conversations, the letters, the looks on their faces. He had always believed that paperwork mattered, that truth mattered. Now he was learning that sometimes power ignored both. The next morning, he noticed something new. Small orange markings had been sprayed near the edge of his property. They were faint but visible. He knew what they were for. Survey markers. Someone was trying to redraw lines that had already been drawn years ago. He took photos right away. Later that day, went back to the county office. This time, he spoke to his supervisor. He explained everything from the beginning. The supervisor listened carefully and confirmed again that the HOA had no authority over his land. She frowned when he mentioned the survey markings. She told him no official request had been made to change boundaries. That meant the HOA was acting on its own. Hearing that made his situation feel even more serious. The supervisor suggested he keep detailed records: dates, times, photos, letters. She also suggested he speak to a lawyer, not because he was wrong, but because the HOA might not stop easily. He thanked her and left with more copies of official documents. On the drive home, he thought about how strange it was. He had never wanted conflict. He avoided drama. He paid his taxes, kept to himself, helped neighbors when asked, and yet here he was, being treated like a problem simply because he refused to accept something untrue. Back at home, another car slowed down near his property. This time it did not stop, but the feeling was the same: watched, measured, judged. He began changing his routine. He locked doors more carefully. He checked the mailbox with caution. He started documenting everything in a notebook. Every visit, every letter, every odd detail. It made him feel slightly more in control. One evening, a neighbor from down the road stopped by. The neighbor spoke quietly, glancing around before talking. He said the HOA had tried something similar with another property years ago. That owner had paid fines just to make it stop. The HOA never admitted fault. They just moved on. That story stayed with him. He realized that if he gave in, even a little, it would not end. It would only invite more demands. The HOA was not interested in fairness. They were interested in control. A week passed with no response to his letter. Then, suddenly a new notice arrived. This one listed increased fines. It mentioned ongoing defiance. Reading that word made his jaw tighten. Defiance. As if standing on the truth was an act of rebellion. The notice also included a date for a hearing before the HOA board. He laughed once, short and dry. A hearing for rules he never agreed to. Still, the situation was no longer something he could ignore. The pressure was becoming part of daily life. Even simple things like walking the property or working in the shed felt different. He worried someone would show up again, camera in hand, ready to document another violation. That was when he finally decided to consult a lawyer. The lawyer listened carefully, flipping through the documents with slow, steady movements. After a few minutes, he leaned back and said something that stuck with him. He said this was not about rules. It was about testing boundaries. Some HOAs assumed people would fold rather than fight. The lawyer confirmed what the county had said. The HOA had no legal claim over the land. Any attempt to fine or control him was overreach. But the lawyer also warned that HOAs sometimes relied on intimidation, not law. The solution was to stand firm and be prepared. Walking out of that office, he felt a mix of relief and resolve. He was not wrong. He was not alone. And he was not powerless. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the yard, he sat on the steps of his house. He thought about how quiet life used to be before the letters. How something so simple could turn complicated when control was involved. He looked out at the land again. The same land he bought with honest money. The same land he cared for every day. Nothing had changed about it, except the attention it was getting. He knew now that this situation was far from over. The HOA was not backing down yet. But neither was he. What started as confusion had turned into determination. They wanted him to feel small. Instead, they had pushed him to stand taller. And as the night settled in, he understood something clearly. This was no longer just about his fence or his shed. It was about defending what was his, making sure the truth did not get buried under threats and paperwork. The next move would matter. The pressure became part of his daily routine. Every morning, he checked the mailbox with a tight feeling in his chest. Some days, there was nothing, and those were good days. Other days, another envelope waited, thick and official, reminding him that the HOA was still pushing. Even when no letters came, the silence felt uneasy. Like the pause before another move, he decided to attend the HOA hearing, even though he knew he did not belong there. Not because he respected their authority, but because he wanted to hear face to face how they planned to justify what they were doing. He wanted to look them in the eye and make it clear he was not afraid. The meeting was held in a small community hall inside the HOA neighborhood. Clean lawns, neat houses, quiet streets. Everything looked controlled, almost too perfect. He parked outside and walked in with a folder tucked under his arm. Inside, a long table sat at the front of the room. Several board members were already seated, flipping through papers, speaking in low voices. When they saw him, the room went quiet. He took a seat near the back. The meeting began with routine matters: budgets, landscaping, complaints about trash bins and parking. Listening to it all, he felt even more out of place. These were rules for a community he was never part of. Finally, his case was called. One of the board members spoke, reading from a prepared statement. They listed violations again: fence height, shed placement, driveway condition. Each point was spoken as if it were fact, not opinion. When they finished, they looked at him, waiting. He stood up slowly and walked to the front. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply placed his folder on the table and opened it. He explained that his land was not under their authority. He showed county records, surveys, deeds. He pointed to clear boundary lines and dates. Older than the HOA itself, some board members avoided his eyes. Others frowned. One leaned forward and said their documents showed something different. He asked to see them. There was an uncomfortable pause. They produced a map that looked newer, cleaner, and far less detailed. It showed lines that stretched farther than the original development. He recognized it immediately. It was not a county map. It had no official seal, no record number. He pointed that out calmly. The room shifted. The confidence the board had started with began to thin. One member said the matter would be reviewed further. Another suggested legal counsel would decide. No one admitted fault. No one apologized. The hearing ended without resolution. As he walked out, he felt something settle inside him. They had nothing solid, just pressure and assumption. 2 days later, his lawyer contacted him. The HOA had reached out, asking for time to review documents. That sounded reasonable on the surface, but it also felt like delay. Time was something the HOA used well. They hoped waiting would wear him down. Instead of waiting, his lawyer filed a formal notice. It demanded the HOA stop all enforcement attempts immediately. It included copies of county confirmation and warned of legal consequences if harassment continued. That letter changed things. Within a week, the tone of communication shifted. The letter stopped threatening fines and started using careful language. Words like dispute replaced violation. Review replaced enforcement. It was subtle, but clear. They were adjusting their stance. Still, pressure had not fully lifted. One afternoon, a survey crew appeared near the road again. This time, he confronted them before they could mark anything. They explained they were hired by the HOA to confirm boundaries. He told them firmly that they were not allowed on his property. He showed them the official county maps. After a few phone calls, they packed up and left. That small victory felt important. At the same time, he began hearing from others. A neighbor stopped him one evening and said word was spreading. People were talking about the HOA pushing too far. Some residents were starting to question old fines and rules. Others were quietly watching to see how his situation ended. He did not seek attention, but it found him anyway. One evening, another letter arrived. This one was different. It invited discussion. No fines, no deadlines, just a request to clarify property boundaries. He read it twice, then handed it to his lawyer. The lawyer smiled slightly. He said this was what backing down looked like when pride stood in the way of apology. They agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a small office, neutral ground. 2 HOA representatives attended, along with their attorney. On his side, it was just him and his lawyer. The room felt tense, but controlled. Papers were exchanged. Maps were compared. Dates were checked. The truth stood firm. Every official record confirmed the same thing. The HOA had expanded its assumed boundary without legal approval. Whether by mistake or intention, they had tried to enforce rules where they had no right to do so. The HOA attorney spoke carefully. He acknowledged inconsistencies. He suggested the issue came from outdated internal maps. He avoided the word fault. His lawyer responded just as calmly. He said, intent did not matter as much as action. Harassment had occurred. Threats had been made. Stress had been caused. Silence followed. In the end, the HOA agreed to stop all enforcement related to his property. They agreed in writing that his land was not part of the HOA. They also agreed to remove his address from their system entirely. No apology was offered. No responsibility admitted. But it was enough. When the agreement was signed, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Weeks of tension eased in a single moment. He did not feel victorious in a loud way. It was quieter than that. Like standing down after holding a heavy load for too long. Driving home, the land looked the same as always. The fence. The shed. The driveway. But he felt different standing on it now. More aware, more grounded. That evening, he sat outside as the sun went down. The sky changed colors slowly. For the first time in a while, he felt calm. Still, something lingered. The HOA had stopped, but the experience had changed how he saw things. He realized how easily power could reach beyond its limits. How simple it was for pressure to turn into control if no one pushed back. He thought about the people who might not have the time, money, or confidence to fight like he did. How many might have paid fines they did not owe, just to keep peace? That thought stayed with him. A few days later, he noticed the survey markings were gone. No more cars slowing near his driveway. No more letters. Life slowly returned to normal, but he kept the folder. All the documents stayed organized and ready. Not because he expected trouble again, but because he understood something now. Peace was not just given. Sometimes it had to be defended. As he walked his land that night, the quiet felt earned. For a short while, things stayed quiet. Too quiet. He went back to his normal routine, waking early, working around the property, fixing small things that had been ignored during the weeks of stress. On the surface, it felt like the problem had passed. But deep down, he sensed it was not truly over. The HOA had stepped back. They had not stepped away. That feeling proved right sooner than expected. One morning, another letter arrived. It was not threatening, but it was formal. It said the HOA had new information and intended to reopen the matter. They claimed the earlier agreement was based on incomplete records. Reading that line made his chest tighten. He had seen this move before. When pressure failed, they changed the story. He did not panic. Instead, he called his lawyer and forwarded the letter. The lawyer responded quickly and said, this was a serious escalation. The HOA was now contradicting a written agreement. That crossed a line. A few days later, a notice followed. This one stated the HOA planned to file a legal claim to assert authority over the land. It was written in careful language, but the meaning was clear. They were not ready to let go. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the paper. He felt tired, but also steady. The fear he felt in the beginning was gone. In its place was something firmer. He knew the truth. He had proof. If this went to court, the facts would not change. The lawyer confirmed that the HOA had officially filed the case. That was the moment. Everything became public. Court dates were scheduled. Documents were exchanged. The quiet issue between a homeowner and an HOA turned into a legal dispute that others started to notice. Neighbors began asking questions. Some offered support. Others stayed silent but watched closely. Preparing for court was slow and detailed. Every document mattered. Every letter, every photo, every record was reviewed. He spent evenings going through paperwork, reliving the stress again and again. It was draining, but necessary. On the day of the first hearing, he arrived early. The courthouse was larger than he expected. Cold floors, high ceilings, long hallways filled with echoes. He sat on a bench outside the courtroom, holding his folder, waiting. When the HOA representatives arrived, they avoided looking at him. Their lawyer spoke quietly with them, flipping through papers. They looked confident, but there was tension in their movements. Inside the courtroom, the judge listened carefully. The HOA argued that boundary errors had been made in the past, and that newer interpretations gave them authority. Their lawyer spoke smoothly, using careful words, suggesting confusion rather than wrongdoing. When it was his turn, his lawyer spoke plainly. He presented official county records, surveys, and historical maps. He showed dates proving the land existed outside the HOA before it was ever formed. He explained the harassment, the threats, the repeated attempts to force compliance without authority. The judge asked questions. Direct questions: why were fines issued before ownership was proven? Why were survey crews sent without approval? Why was a written agreement ignored? The HOA struggled to answer clearly. The judge did not rule that day. Instead, more hearings were scheduled. It was clear this would not end quickly. Weeks passed. Each court date added more pressure to the HOA's case. County officials were called to testify. Surveyors explained how boundaries worked. Old records were compared to new claims. With every session, the truth became harder to deny. During one hearing, a county official stated clearly that the HOA's boundary expansion had never been approved. The room went silent. That statement carried weight. The judge looked directly at the HOA's lawyer and asked why enforcement actions were taken without confirmation. There was no strong answer at the same time. Something else began happening outside the courtroom. HOA residents started paying attention. Word spread that the HOA was being questioned by a judge. People began reviewing their own fines and rules. Some realized they had been charged unfairly in the past. A few residents attended hearings quietly, sitting in the back. Listening, pressure shifted. What once felt like one person standing alone now felt like a spotlight turning toward the HOA itself. Still, the process was exhausting. Court schedules changed. Delays happened. Paperwork piled up. There were days when he felt worn down, not from fear, but from the slow grind of it all. Life felt paused, but each time doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he started. This was never about winning. It was about stopping something wrong. One afternoon, his lawyer called with news. The judge had reviewed additional filings and requested a final hearing. That usually meant a decision was coming. The final hearing took place on a gray morning. The courtroom felt heavier than before. Everyone knew this was the turning point. The HOA's lawyer tried one last angle. He argued that even if the land was not officially part of the HOA, it should still follow community standards for the good of the area. It sounded less like law and more like opinion. The judge did not seem impressed. When it was time for closing statements, his lawyer spoke simply. He said rules only mattered when authority was real. He said property rights could not be assumed or taken by pressure. He said allowing this behavior would open the door for abuse. The judge listened without interruption. After a long pause, the judge spoke. He stated clearly that the HOA had no legal authority over the land. He said their actions were improper. He said enforcement without ownership was unacceptable. He ordered the HOA to stop all attempts immediately and permanently. He also ordered them to cover legal costs. The room was silent. He felt his shoulders relax for the first time in months, not in relief alone, but in validation. The truth had been heard. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter. The HOA representatives left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Some residents lingered, whispering among themselves. He walked out slowly, breathing deeply. The fight was over. In the days that followed, the impact spread. The HOA sent notices to residents explaining policy reviews. Board members resigned quietly. Rules were rewritten. Boundaries were clarified. He returned to his quiet life, but it did not feel the same as before. It felt stronger. One evening, he stood on his land as the sun went down. The fence cast long shadows. The shed sat where it always had. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. He knew Part 5 would not be about court or conflict. It would be about what came after. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm after the court decision. At first, it felt strange waking up without tension in his chest. For months, his mornings had started with worry, checking the mailbox, watching the road, waiting for the next move. Now, there was nothing waiting. No letters. No cars slowing down. No quiet threats hidden in polite words. Just silence, the good kind. He kept expecting the calm to break, but it didn't. Days turned into weeks. He focused on small things again. Fixing a loose board on the fence, cleaning out the shed, walking the land in the early evening when the air cooled and the sky softened. These simple routines felt meaningful in a new way. They reminded him why he fought in the first place. Neighbors began stopping by more often. Some thanked him quietly. Others asked questions, careful ones, as if still unsure how much could be said. A few admitted they had paid fines in the past without understanding why. One older neighbor said he always felt something was off but never had the energy to push back. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't want to be seen as one. He was just someone who refused to accept something that wasn't true. Still, he understood now that standing firm had effects beyond his own land. It had given others permission to question. The HOA sent out an official notice a month later. It explained that boundaries had been reviewed and corrected. It mentioned changes to leadership and promised more transparency going forward. The words were careful and polite. There was still no apology, but there was acceptance. That was enough. He noticed small changes in the neighborhood nearby. Fewer warning notices. Fewer complaints posted online. People seemed less tense. It was subtle, but real. Power had pulled back just a little. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sky darken, he thought about how close he came to giving in at the start. How easy it would have been to tear down the shed, lower the fence, pay a fine just to avoid trouble. Many people would have done that, not because they were wrong, but because they were tired. He understood that feeling now more than ever. What surprised him most was how much the experience changed his view of ownership. Owning land was not just about paperwork or boundaries. It was about responsibility, knowing your rights, protecting them calmly, without hate, without fear. He kept the folder of documents, but he no longer checked it. It stayed in a drawer, organized and untouched, not as a reminder of stress, but as proof that preparation mattered. There were moments when anger surfaced unexpectedly. Not sharp anger, but a dull kind. When he thought about the sleepless nights, the stress, the pressure, when he remembered how easily authority could be misused, but he did not hold on to that feeling. Carrying it felt like letting the conflict follow him forever. Instead, he focused on peace. One afternoon, he noticed children from a nearby house walking past the edge of his land. They waved. He waved back. It was a small thing, but it made him smile. Life was moving forward, quietly and normally, just as he liked it. He began sleeping better. The constant alertness faded. He no longer jumped at the sound of a car door or footsteps near the fence. His body slowly unlearned the habit of stress. Sometimes, late at night, he reflected on how close the situation came to changing his life in a much bigger way. Legal costs, property risk, emotional strain, all from a claim that never should have existed. That thought made him more aware of others facing similar battles. Often alone, he didn't seek out conflict. But when people asked for advice, he shared what he learned. Keep records. Stay calm. Don't assume authority is always right. Facts matter. Persistence matters. He learned that silence often benefits those in power. Speaking up, even quietly, can shift things. Months later, the HOA board announced new elections. Several longtime members stepped down. New faces took their place. The language around rules softened. There was more listening, less commanding. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. He watched all of it from a distance. He was no longer involved, no longer targeted. One evening, he walked the full boundary of his land just as the sun was setting. The sky glowed orange and purple. He traced the fence line slowly, feeling the ground under his feet. This land had tested him not by its nature, but by what others tried to claim. Standing there, he felt a quiet pride. Not loud, not showy. Just a steady sense of knowing he did the right thing. He didn't win by overpowering anyone. He won by refusing to move when he was already standing on solid ground. As time passed, the story faded into the background of daily life. It became something he thought about less often. But when he did remember, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with clarity. The experience taught him that peace is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes, peace comes after conflict. When you face it honestly and walk through it without losing yourself, on a cool morning, nearly a year later, he found himself standing by the mailbox again. Out of habit, he paused before opening it. Then he smiled at himself. There was nothing to fear now. Inside were only ordinary things. A bill, a flyer, a letter from a friend. Ordinary felt good. He walked back to the house, closed the door, and went on with his day. The land outside was quiet, unchanged, and fully his. And this time, that truth would not be questioned again. The morning felt different, even before he fully realized why. He woke up without the tight feeling that had followed him for months. No rush to check the phone. No pause before getting out of bed. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles deep. Not the kind that waits to be broken. He stepped outside with a cup of coffee and stood on the porch for a long moment. The land stretched out in front of him, calm and familiar. Birds moved through the trees. A light breeze passed through the grass. Nothing about the place had changed, yet it felt new again. After the court decision, life did not suddenly become exciting or dramatic. It became normal, and that was exactly what he wanted. The first few weeks were about rest. Not the kind you plan, but the kind that happens when stress finally lets go. He slept longer. His shoulders stopped feeling stiff. He noticed small things again, like how the light hit the fence in the afternoon, or how quiet the evenings really were. The letters never came back at first. He still checked the mailbox carefully, half expecting another envelope with firm language and bold warnings. But day after day, there was nothing but ordinary mail. Bills, flyers, notes that had nothing to do with control or rules. Slowly, he stopped expecting trouble. Neighbors began acting more relaxed around him too. Some waved more often. A few stopped by just to talk. They didn't bring drama with them, just curiosity and honesty. One neighbor admitted he always felt nervous when the HOA sent notices. Another said he didn't even read half of what they sent anymore because it made him anxious. He listened quietly. He didn't brag. He didn't lecture. He simply shared what he went through when asked. What surprised him most was how many people said the same thing in different ways. They said they didn't know they could question things. They didn't know they could ask for proof. They didn't know they were allowed to say no. That stayed with him. The HOA eventually sent out a formal update to residents. It explained that boundaries had been reviewed and corrected. It said procedures would be changed. It talked about fairness and transparency. The language was careful and calm. There was no mention of him. No apology. Just an acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. He didn't need more than that. Board members changed. Some quietly stepped away. New people stepped in. Rules were rewritten. The tone shifted from strict to reasonable. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. He watched all of it from a distance. One afternoon, found the old folder of documents while cleaning out a drawer. He opened it and flipped through the pages. Surveys, court papers, letters, proof of something he never should have had to prove. He closed the folder and placed it back where it belonged. He wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned out during the fight. What remained was understanding. He understood how systems could drift beyond their limits. How authority could become comfortable pushing until someone pushed back. How silence often made things easier for those in charge. He also understood his own strength better now. Not the loud kind, not the aggressive kind. The steady kind. The kind that waits, listens, and stands firm when needed. Evenings became his favorite time again. He would sit outside as the sun dipped low, watching shadows stretch across the land. The fence, once a symbol of conflict, was just a fence again. The shed was just a shed. Normal things, living their normal purpose. Sometimes he thought about how close he came to giving up early on. How easy it would have been to tear things down, pay fines, and avoid trouble. No one would have blamed him. Most people would have done exactly that. But then, nothing would have changed. That thought gave him quiet satisfaction. Not pride, but peace. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The land moved through its usual cycle. Rain came and went. Leaves fell and returned. Life continued, steady and honest. One day, a younger neighbor asked him a question while walking past. The question was simple. How did you know when to fight and when to let go? He thought about it for a moment before answering. He said it wasn't about fighting. It was about knowing what was true. When something false keeps pushing into your life, standing still can feel like resistance. The neighbor nodded. Thoughtful. That moment felt important. He didn't become an activist. He didn't join committees. He didn't seek attention. He just lived his life with a little more awareness than before. He read things more carefully. He asked questions when something didn't feel right. He trusted his instincts more. Late one night, nearly a year after the first letter arrived, he stood by the fence under a quiet sky. Stars were visible. The air was cool. He rested his hand on the wood and felt grounded. This land had taught him something unexpected. Not about ownership, but about patience. Not about power, but about clarity. He realized that real control often shows up quietly, wrapped in formal words and official paper, and real freedom often looks just as quiet. A calm morning, a peaceful evening, a life uninterrupted. As he walked back toward the house, he felt a simple truth settle in him. He didn't win by shouting. He didn't win by threatening. He won by staying steady when others tried to move him. Inside the house, the lights were warm, familiar, safe. He closed the door, leaving the land quiet behind him. Not because it needed protection anymore, but because it was finally, fully at rest, and this time, nothing was trying to take that away.